Welcome back to Detailed, an original podcast by ARCAT. This is the show where we uncover lessons learned to help you navigate your next project. I'm Cherise Lakeside, Senior Spec Writer at RDH Building Science, and your host. My guest today is Nici Stauffer, Senior Associate at Holst Architecture in Portland, Oregon. Nici has experience with diverse project types, ranging from affordable and market rate multifamily housing to office, civic, and nonprofit projects. Her holistic approach to design strives to create healthy and productive environments that positively impact the community. Nici recently completed the Julia West House, a 12-story mass timber tower that will provide 90 units of permanent supportive housing designed with older adults in mind. A licensed architect and Living Future accredited professional, Nici holds a Master of Architecture from the University of Oregon, go Ducks, and a Bachelor of Arts in Slavic Languages and Literature from the University of Washington. The project we're talking about today is the Julia West House in Portland, Oregon. In a city grappling with record rates of houselessness, Portland is advancing some of its most ambitious strategies yet to address its growing humanitarian crisis. Julia West House stands as a transformative example of what permanent supportive housing, or PSH, can look like when care, culture, and innovation converge, incorporating exposed mass timber and a biophilic interior palette grounded in the ecology of the Pacific Northwest. Now, let's get into the details. Welcome back to Detailed. My guest today is Nici Stauffer, Senior Associate at Holst Architecture here in my lovely, not war-ravaged hometown of Portland, Oregon. The project we're chatting about today is the Julia West House, also here in Portland. Nici, welcome to Detailed. I'm so excited to have you. How are you today?
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this project.
Well, I'm really excited to have Holst back in the house. You guys are always welcome in my book at this point. I always start every interview with some random icebreaker question that I typically come up with in my brain after I go troll you on the internet. And so for you, I noticed as I was reading your bio information that in addition to being a licensed architect, you have a Bachelor of Arts in, I'm going to say that again. You have a Bachelor of Arts in Slavic languages and literature, which is not something you see every day. I had to go look because I'm from Finland. And is that Slavic? And no, apparently it's not. So tell me that's just such a kind of out of left field kind of thing. Tell me about that and what made you pursue that degree.
Yeah. It's funny. I don't get to talk about this very much in my current profession as an architect, but I did start out at my undergraduate studies at University of Washington. Young, hadn't been out of the house yet. I was really still a little unsure of what I wanted to do, but my family is from Czechia, formerly Czech Republic. My mom was born there and was an immigrant to the US when she was about 9 or 10 years old. So I grew up around my Czech family pretty closely, actually. And while I heard little snippets of the language, definitely learned a lot about our culture, I wanted to study more in depth. And University of Washington actually had a Czech language program and a Slavic department. So I was like, what, maybe I want to travel, maybe I want to teach. So I just started out in that field and really enjoyed it and ended up traveling abroad after graduating, teaching English in the Czech Republic at the time. That's what it was called. And yeah, I think it just brought me a lot closer to my culture and helped my language skills and was just really important to me, but didn't end up being what I chose as a profession.
Well, mad respect. So there's the second item you and I have in common. My mom was born in Finland and came over to the United States when she was about 3. And so I am a first generation American. And I thought at one point I would try to learn Finnish. And gave up. And I grew up listening to it because my grandma and my mom always spoke Finnish around me,
Mhm.
which drove me
Exactly.
insane as a kid. Um, and so I grew up at we lost my grandma when I was 17, but I grew up hearing it. So I thought, well, I'll probably pick this up easier. Oh, that is a hard language to learn. Really hard language. And so I'm not going to say I gave it my best effort, but I gave up rather quickly. So mad respect for you for that. And it must have been really exciting to get to go over
Yeah.
there and get in touch. I have not yet been to Finland, and I have hundreds of relatives there.
Yeah, it felt great to just, like, see the places where my mom grew up and, like, understand a little bit more in depth, where my family comes from.
So let's talk about the Julia West House. There's so much going on here that I'm interested, but let's just start with a little background on the project. What was the need, and who is this building? Who does this building serve, or who will it serve?
Yeah, well, as we know, I think there's overall a housing shortage in this country and in this state and in Portland. We need all kinds of housing for families, for aging adults, for, like the need is so great. So every one of these projects is so important. And this building is going to be serving aging adults 55 and older who have experienced or are at risk of homelessness in our community. We have a lot of great project partners involved, and it just really is it's such a needed building for this community.
We do the whole West Coast. I've got my son is living up in Seattle. They have similar problems. You hear about it all over California. I've done a few interviews on projects in California doing the exact same type of buildings because of that shortage.
Yeah.
Um, Before we get into building specific details, just give me a broad description of the scope of this project and what all is included in this building.
Yeah, so it's located in downtown Portland, in a pretty dense area with a mix of different building types. It's a pretty small site with we'll have 90 units of housing, including mostly studios with about 30 one-bedroom units as well. We'll also have all the supportive services that permanent supportive housing should have in buildings. So service providers there to support residents and make sure that their experience in housing is successful and they have all the tools they need to thrive. We also will have community spaces for residents. These are pretty efficiently sized units. So, community rooms, places to gather and build community with your neighbors, places to meet with those service providers and all their offices and spaces they need to support residents, in building laundry, a food pantry, and then all the other bits and pieces that every building needs, like utilities, etc.
Yeah, utilities are kind of important.
They are.
So you just mentioned service providers. There are multiple providers for this project, including the Northwest Pilot Project, Native American Rehabilitation Association, and the Community for Positive Aging, in addition to the Owner and Property Management Group. Tell me, I've done a lot of public work as well in my career. And sometimes on some of these, and I've worked on projects like this in the past. Sometimes you can get a lot of cooks in the kitchen, which is not a bad thing. Tell me about the planning and programming phase for this project. Like, how did you manage the decision making and keep things moving with so many, interested parties with probably diverse lenses
Mhm.
on what they needed to see happen?
Yeah, I think, yeah, this definitely applies to every project. In general, I'd say at Holst, like, we always strive to include as many voices of stakeholders on projects as possible because that's how we get the best results and the buildings that are the most functional, for their needs. In this case, I actually felt, even though there are a lot of people involved, everyone kind of understood the assignment. We knew this building was gonna be small. It's tough to fit all those things, those big, like, wants, in these buildings, so I think everybody was on the same page that we don't have a lot to work with here, but we're all, we all have a common goal, which is to make this building as functional as possible, make it feel like home for residents, and also be as safe for both residents and folks working in the building. So we had a lot of early meetings, usually together with all the stakeholders and property management and the owner, going over things like, what do we really need? Where can we share space that makes sense? Like, where are our goals common enough that, we don't really need our own separate space for this? And that helped us pretty quickly whittle it down to like, what could we fit and what were the most critical things that had to go in the building?
Well, it's funny because I've seen a process where you have a lot of involved parties work really, really well, plenty of times, and I've seen it be a complete disaster as well.
Mhm.
And one of the things I feel like we're losing in our industry, just with the advancement of technology, is that just critical benefit of having those everybody's faces in one room on occasion.
Mhm.
And you don't get the same thing from a Zoom meeting. You can to a certain degree, and other things can happen, but having everybody in one room, hearing the discussion, informing the discussion, making the decisions together is so much more efficient sometimes than 50,000 emails going back and forth trying
Yeah,
to get to a response,
definitely.
just hashing it out in person. So I applaud that process. So your project description mentions biophilia and mass timber innovations, among other things that we'll get into. Um, but I want to start with those two. So let's dig into how each one of these come into play for this building, starting with the biophilia.
Yeah, I should have mentioned in the overall project description, this is a mass timber building, which is super exciting. So I think biophilia is a topic that we're hearing more and more about. It's really just like bringing nature and references to the natural world into buildings and how that helps people. For this project, I think the mass timber really did a lot of heavy lifting for us, right? Like most housing buildings, you're surrounded by white walls, painted finishes. Like you're not getting a lot of wood often in these affordable housing projects. So having the whole structural system being a CLT floor meant that we could expose that wood in the building, and residents in their units and in common spaces and staff members always kind of have that view of this natural, beautiful material just throughout their daily life, which is really great for this project. Not to mention, the added benefits of wood in buildings and indoor air quality and all those things. So that was definitely a huge part. Um, we also focused on a pretty natural material palette, like curving sort of acoustic ceiling baffles. There's also some custom artwork going in the building from a couple of different local artists, which is going to be really beautiful. And those are mostly nature scenes, which are gonna be great.
Well, I will tell you, I come from pretty humble beginnings, and I lived in affordable housing for a number of years as a young girl. And it was not a warm place, a warm, inviting place to be. One place we lived had literally had concrete
Mhm.
walls, interior walls. Like you couldn't hang anything on the wall because they were concrete. Um, and that is a game changer on mindset and how someone feels and how they
Mhm.
feel value to the world. Like, do I matter enough to have a nice place to live?
Mhm.
Which I think somebody who maybe has never lived in affordable housing could probably look at it that way.
Mhm.
So I love that. Tell me a little bit more about the mass timber. Like, what
Yeah.
did you do? Because it's beautiful.
Yeah, so it's a 12-story building, so it's a high rise, and it's more recently been, included in our building code in the US. Depending on the state you're in, it's a little different, but in Oregon, we're pretty far at the forefront in terms of, using these materials in taller buildings. So it's Type 4B, and it's post and beam. So that means we're using glulam, columns, and beams to support these 5-ply, so 5 layers of wood to create the CLT floor panels. So the majority of the structure is wood, though we do have some steel for the lateral system as well.
I love mass timber buildings. I really
Me too.
do. I did another interview recently where they and I think that building was also 12 stories, and it was the first one in their state. I also love that Oregon's a leader in sustainability and mass timber and some of these more innovative ways to build. So I read that this is the tallest mass timber building in the region and the first to utilize recent load testing to justify two-way spanning CLT floor panels without beams in the corridors.
Yes.
Tell me, I've also worked with the building departments here. Tell me about that process and how you became the first to do this.
Yeah. So it definitely was a journey. It's a lot harder to get these things through when we haven't seen examples. Like everybody's sort of examining the code, trying to make sure we're on the same page on our interpretations. There's a lot of different people involved. It's not, we're talking to the city, we're talking to the engineers, the contractor. All these things come into play. And for this one, I think the project really benefited from the fact that we adopted some early provisions of the 2024 IBC, which allowed us to expose more of the wood in the building. Previously, you were limited on like how much of your ceilings you could expose to the structure. And the 2024 editions allowed us to expose the entire ceiling per fire area, essentially. So that gave us a lot more room to choose where we wanted wood exposed in the building, and gave us a code path to say, like, this is already outright acceptable. I would say the two-way spanning CLT floors was a really helpful component for housing in general, and I imagine will be on many other project types, because what that means is that, like I said earlier, it's post and beam. We have columns and beams supporting these panels, but in our corridors, where we use these two-way panels, it means we don't have to have a beam crossing that corridor every so many feet, which opens up that space for MEP routing through the building, which in every project you have to find space for, but in housing, like, those corridors do a lot of work. So it really helped us to keep our ceiling heights, around 8 feet, for the most part, and then taller where the CLT is exposed, and it also helped us to not have to increase our floor-to-floor heights, which for housing, a lot of projects are around 10 feet. For this project, it was 10'6" floor-to-floor, so we only needed a little extra room, and that was really to get, if there was a beam somewhere interior to a unit, or like, to try to get mechanical equipment underneath. But that two-way span was really critical. To jump into the, like, getting that part permitted piece, it was a little bit challenging, but really only in that we had to communicate carefully with our city officials. We were really fortunate that our structural engineering team is KPFF, and they were involved directly in that testing that was done to support the two-way panel span systems. So very knowledgeable, talk through it with the structural reviewer every step of the way, and ultimately we were able to get that approved. Um, One thing I just wanted to add
Go
that was
ahead.
so cool, because the two-way panels, I happened to be on site the day that they were installed at one of the floors, and the connection detailing around those areas was really interesting. It was so carefully, orchestrated between Carpentry Plus, our mass timber installer, the detailing from KPFF, and then the team at Walsh Construction, and it just dropped into place so easily. It was really interesting to see.
Well, I happen to have two very close friends at Walsh. Um, they know their stuff, and they have done some innovative buildings, so they are not a bad person to have on your team, or a bad company to have on your team. So you triggered a couple other questions there in talking about that mass timber. So the first one, and maybe this is a stupid question because I ask this on occasion because I don't know any better. So having more of the mass timber exposed than you normally do. Did you have to do anything special with the wood in the way of like fire protection in order to have more of that wood exposed?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting, like, the big open spaces of wood being exposed is the easy part. It's really how you manage the detailing around where those panels meet columns and beams, where columns and beams come together that are exposed. And even in some of the, like, covered conditions, we still had to, have a little extra attention to that. So this project did go through quite a few building code appeals just to prove that some of the testing that already is available, for example, like the ACBH hangers that we're seeing a lot at these mass timber conferences. It's a little plate that's on the column and a plate that's on the beam, and they come together. There's a lot of testing around how those work and how you protect them with intumescent fire tape around all the edges, and it's routed into the wood. That's something that already exists, but also something that we had to appeal with the city just based on our specific project parameters. And how it would meet that testing. So we did work with a fire protection engineer to produce a couple of reports, just to prove that we were meeting the intent of the code with all of our special connection details.
Yeah, these mass timber buildings certainly have their own unique set of circumstances when you're blazing a trail with things nobody's done before. So another thing, another curveball question. I've done a number of interviews over the last, I think we're going on 4 years now, 3 years, on mass timber buildings. And one of the continuing challenges that guests have brought up to me are those MEP systems, and finding where you're going to put them and especially if you have more of the mass timber exposed, because you don't have the same like potential wall cavity involved, and you may or may not have space over the ceiling. So how did that go? I also did 6.5 years in MEP, so a little curious about that. How did that go with your systems for this building, and where'd you put everything?
Yeah, especially on a small project site like this one. Well, the majority of our equipment is on the roof, which is helpful. I mean, it's a very dense forest of MEP equipment up there. We had some key shafts that came all the way through the building. And then, like I said, those residential corridors really did the heavy lifting in terms of maintaining and like managing all those different runs going through the building. And it's actually a good lesson learned for us on the project because initially we were thinking, well, we can expose this wood everywhere. Why wouldn't we do this in the corridors as well? But really the reality of how much, duct work and cable trays and refrigerant lines are going through, it's hard to make that stuff super tidy, and at the end, the volume, like, you just wouldn't see the wood at all. So we ended up covering those areas and dropping in a ceiling.
I was just curious because I was like, okay, where'd they put it? I have to know where they
Yeah,
put it.
and with housing too, like, there's so many more, like, plumbing drops everywhere.
Yeah.
When you get down to, like, your community rooms or lobby levels, like, you're gonna have units above that are, dropping utilities down through, so that's where we kinda use these acoustic ceiling baffles to sort of hide a little bit or obscure some of the, like, clutter at the ceilings, but also give you glimpses through to the wood.
Is any of it exposed, the systems? I know we do a lot of that in Portland where you can see the piping or, and some of those
Mhm.
things.
There are in a couple of spaces, and it's, done as cleanly as possible, but, yeah, you just kinda have to embrace it in a few
Yeah.
of those areas. Mhm.
Well, we're good at that here. I don't have
Yeah.
a problem with it. I've seen some places that are beautiful and they've got
Mhm.
everything exposed. So this project, I had to go searching around a little bit. This project's in downtown Portland. So I went and looked online and I saw this site, and it's in the middle of a bunch of other buildings. Um, so tell me a little bit about, number one, where did this site come from, or how did this site get chosen? And you've already mentioned it's a small, tight site. So what did you have to work with, and how did the site that you have to work with it affect your building design?
Yes, the site was absolutely one of the most challenging parts of this project because it's 50 by 100 feet, which, just as a frame of reference, is the size of a typical single family residential lot in Portland. And driving by it earlier on before the project started, you probably wouldn't really notice it. It was this tiny little private surface parking lot. Uh, and it was next to an older two-story building that was kind of run down, and it was across the street from, a church, and I know that the community development partners, our client on this project, had a relationship with that church, and I believe acquired the land from them. So super tiny little pocket of property right next to a two-story parking structure, and then an older, residential building on the other side, and then 2 main streets on the other 2 elevations. So it really was, a tight project, and I think the biggest challenges related to that were just, 1, how do we fit the number of units we need to fit to make this project pencil? That included some building appeals even for the size of the units and talking through how we were going to make these units livable and, comfortable and, meet all the requirements needed even with a slightly smaller footprint. Um, we also kind of used creatively the Oriole provisions, which allowed us to pull our building facade out over the property line at the upper floors. That really helped us just because we couldn't do a lot with the building massing on that tight footprint. We couldn't carve in. We can't lose square footage. So the Orioles allowed us to bring the massing out a little bit and make some a little bit more interesting moves on the facade, so it wouldn't be so flat. And then I think the other thing is just, any project that's downtown, adjacent to buildings, adjacent to city streets, shoring is always a big component of that. So that was a pretty tough system to work through, just being adjacent to old structures and not really knowing what's going on below grade once you start, demoing things on site.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned below grade because I a number of times in projects in different places, but in projects that are in this type of location, one of when we talk about the site itself, one of the things that seems to pop up fairly regularly in a neighborhood that's, in an area that's been around a long time is, oh, we started digging and found out, and obviously the site was covered by a parking lot to begin with. Was there any problem with the ground? Any like I did one project and it had been a dry cleaning business for like 50 years, but the site had been like nothing on it. That business had been demolished and nothing had been on it for years. And somehow someone didn't know that's what it used to be. Well, they had dumped all their dry cleaning chemicals into the ground.
Mm,
It was at
mhm,
a different day and age. And they had to dig a long ways down and replace all the
mhm.
dirt because of that
Yeah.
contamination. Was there any issues like that with the site or, having to, do anything particular with the actual ground itself so you could build on it?
Not too much, no. I'd say we were lucky in that regard. I think the big discoveries were really, the usual like remnants of building below grade or in our case along some of the property line areas, like old buildings, they weren't really sticking precisely to property lines. So some, foundations of other buildings kind of encroaching into our space and changing what we had to do with our shoring design. So I think that was probably the biggest challenge with the low grade work.
Well, that's good. Let's start. I like to kind of work my way from the outside in of the building. So let's start with talking about your exterior building enclosure design. And because I work for a building enclosure consultant, obviously
Mhm.
I'm extra interested in that. Um, Describe some of the unique exterior and structural design components of this design, including some of your material choices.
Yeah. So the design is based on some natural imagery from the Columbia River Gorge. The team was really hoping to reference the local landscape more so than local built structure. So we were kind of basing the design off of imagery of those tall basalt columns that you see if you drive down 84 and are looking across the river. So really, it's a pretty simple massing. We had a simple site footprint to deal with. So kind of extruding from the site and then using that oriel window provision I mentioned earlier to bring the facade out over the property line and create this fissure as you move up the building. That's that crack along 13th, and that actually we're using a copper colored metal panel to connect the community spaces at level 1 up that fissure to level 12 where there's a big community room and roof patio.
So you probably had to know this question was coming. What did you do to assure a tight, energy efficient building enclosure? This is a Portland project.
Yeah.
Yeah, sustainability is practically our middle name. And assuming, obviously, just for the type of building it is and facility management costs down the road, that's always an important thing. So, what did you do here to make sure that you really had an energy efficient building?
Yeah, so the exterior walls are metal stud framing, all non-combustible when you're using a mass timber structure. Everything else in the building is non-combustible. So metal studs. Instead of doing bat insulation, we really typically will push for blown in to make sure that we're filling all the little cracks and crevices within the framing. So that was one thing. Um, Current energy code thankfully does require exterior rigid insulation as well. So the building has 2 inches of rock wool insulation at the exterior. And then also, this project was going after NGBS certification, National Green Building Standards. So we worked with Northwest Energy Collaborative, and there were some provisions within that certification that also was focused in on improving our envelope. That would include visual inspections of the exterior weather barriers on site, which we which went great. Actually, Walsh was really attentive to making sure the install was very tight, and then also some compartmentalized blower door testing at units throughout the project. So all that had to pass in order to get our certifications. Another thing I would say our spec typically for windows is a higher performing window than is required by baseline code. So those are all some things that we were focused on to make sure that the building was designed well and had a nice tight envelope.
You mentioned that all of the systems, you have a lot of systems on the roof. It's dense up there, and there's a lot of weight involved with that. What did you do with your roofing?
The roofing is an EPDM membrane.
And no issues with the weight up there or anything special you had to do to
Not
accommodate that?
Not any major issues. It is a lot of equipment, and it is very heavy. We did, get some Portland Clean Energy funds that helped the project get a much more efficient MEP system, which was great. So you'll see there's 2 big, heat pump hot water skids up there, a lot of mechanical units, and really it was a coordination with the structural team to make sure that those loads weren't hitting, like, at our panel joints in bad places, like, making sure that it worked with the CLT system did take coordination, but no major issues or, like, upsizing the system to make that work.
I just started thinking about that. It's like, oh, I have to ask
Mhm.
about the roof. So another thing that you mentioned in your project description, and informed. I'm particularly interested in this topic because up until probably the last couple of years, I never really heard this mentioned before. But you talk about trauma informed design and occupant well being, which I think particularly for a building that's servicing this group, that's potentially even more important than ever. Um, what unique considerations did you make in your design to address the needs of these users? Because I'm just really fascinated by trauma informed design and some of the very unique things. In the only couple of times I've heard about it, unique things. I did an interview on a school with a good friend of mine, actually, from Vermont, probably 2 years ago. And it served an immigrant community, and they had to, because those immigrants were coming from a war-torn country. During construction, they had to put up tarps because it was an existing school and they were building the new school next to it. The kids were traumatized seeing the construction site because it looked so much like, a war-torn area. And they were, there's some maybe PTSD kind of responses to that. And I was just so fascinated. So tell me about this building and what kinds of considerations that you made to address that trauma-informed design and the occupant well-being.
Yeah, I think in general, we just tried to follow the most common structure around trauma-informed design, and how could we meet the needs of the majority of people in the building and make it feel safe and like home. So one of the ways we address trauma-informed design and discussed with the service providers in the building as well is making sure we have two ways out of most of our spaces, like not feeling trapped in any room is really important. So, multiple doors out of meeting rooms, out of, offices, and that's safety for residents, but also for staff. And then also clear lines of sight. One thing with high rises is that elevator lobbies have to be used for fire service access in a fire event. So there's a lot more provisions around enclosing those lobbies. And so we went through a code appeal to get glazing in those areas and sprinklered the glazing rather than dealing with solid rated walls, just to make sure there's good visibility in and out of spaces where you might be waiting. I think also just the visibility of the wood and, like, having, natural materials and that access to nature is also, a key part of that. Focusing on, having good daylight in the units, access to fresh air, and then also focusing on acoustics between spaces too. CLT, there's a lot of discussion around flanking noise and concern of noise traveling through panels. So, trying to detail as best as possible to have soffits on either side of unit walls where possible. So, we're mitigating that noise transfer. And then unit demising walls that were above code in terms of their acoustic properties.
Any particular security measures for the building?
Yeah, the building, that's always such a big conversation. That's a huge discussion topic with the service providers, building management, maintenance, having cameras in key areas. Access control is really well thought out and involves everybody's input. Like, where should residents have access? Like, how do people get in the building? Part of that was making one point of access into the building off of 13th and the other exit door being exit only.
So let's talk about the inside of the building. So this building's 12 stories, 51,295 square feet, 90 units for houseless elders and BIPOC individuals. Tell me about the different types of community spaces that you have in this building in a little more detail.
Yeah. So, with these units being small, as I mentioned before, the community spaces we were hopeful could provide that little bit of space outside of your unit to gather with friends and family and meet with service providers. So, level one, you enter into a pretty large and tall lobby space with a little waiting area, somewhere that residents could sit and wait for a ride or wait for a meeting with property management. And then as you move up the hallway, there is another sort of lounge space outside of offices and the mailroom. As you go up to the 12th floor, that's where we prioritize the majority of resident community spaces and it being away from the street. There's a large community kitchen with a space for seating or a table layout. That's also adjacent to more service provider offices, so making those connection points to staff everywhere that residents are spending time. And then the laundry room is also at level 12 because there's no laundry in units for this project. So everybody goes up to do laundry together at level 12.
It was my next question that was going to come out of my mouth is where's the laundry? Because so many buildings and not even, any multifamily buildings love to stick it in the basement. Mm-hmm. And there is nothing worse than, and this comes from my young adult days when I lived in an apartment, and there's nothing worse into going to some below ground, dark room to do your laundry in the evening. It doesn't feel safe. It's creepy, like you're waiting for Jason from the horror movies to jump out from behind the washing machine. And I was just like, please tell me that laundry's on the 12th floor.
Oh, it is. It is, and that's part of that discussion on lines of sight too, which we, talked about at length with service providers. Like, all these community spaces visually have access to places where staff is located as well. So the laundry room's right across from, like, a little conference room and some other offices, and it's on an end of the building where there's windows, so there's daylight in the laundry room. I actually was, helping lead a building tour yesterday, and someone walked in there like, "Oh, a laundry room with a view." It is kind of nice.
Well, gold star on the calendar for Holst today from me, I've got to say. What about the units themselves? Describe those for me.
Yeah, they have a pretty tight footprint. The studios are pretty efficiently laid out. You enter into a little entry space with a lot of built-in storage as you come in on the left. There's a bathroom with the usual sink, toilet, and shower in every unit, as well as built-in storage in the bathrooms. I'd say built-in storage was like one thing we were really trying to get in all of these units, just knowing that people aren't coming in with a lot of furniture or things to fill their space. So having all of that sort of ready to go for people. There's a two burner cooktop in each unit, a microwave, and we actually have got dishwashers in all of the units as well, which is pretty great.
That is pretty
Yeah.
great. Nice. Um, so at the time I was writing these questions, I didn't have any photos of any interiors. So tell me a little bit about the planned aesthetics and material choices outside of the mass timber that you have planned for this building and for the units to make it an even more welcoming place.
Yeah, I think durability is always such a big topic of conversation with building management and maintenance personnel. So the balance is trying to find, ways to make this building both durable but also beautiful. So I think we went pretty minimal but nice with our finishes. The wood, as I said, does a lot of the heavy lifting. But we did end up doing like solid countertops, quartz countertops in the units, which I think look really nice and are quite durable and last a long time. Built-in casework, with the laminate finish, and then LVT flooring throughout, so kind of avoiding carpet, things that could build up and stain over time. And then our community spaces, again, pretty minimal palette, but looking at acoustics, especially for where we could add additional materials like the wavy acoustic baffles at level one, and then acoustic wall paneling where it made sense just to make sure spaces weren't echoey.
So, from a design perspective, what would you say was the most difficult challenge to work out in this design or on this project design, and how did you navigate it?
I think it was really just the small footprint was the biggest thing from a design perspective. We always deal with this on every project. You think you have so much space and then everything starts taking it and then you have none left. So I think early in design, it was really just making sure that we were creating very functional units and focusing on accessibility, knowing the population was going to be 55 and older. Um, while still fitting all of the utilities and everything else in the project. I think that was really the most challenging. Um, while challenging, also fun, I think, was the coordination of the mass timber systems. That's something that you really have to get working on very early in a project like this. You start very early in design with the contractor and with the timber installer and with the structural engineer to get all those details working well so that everybody could be confident that it would go in and be installed smoothly. So it was a challenge, but that's just part of designing with mass timber, and it really, like, you can see the benefit during construction of all that work early on because it really was probably the least complicated part of the construction process.
Well, I've heard from a lot of people that the transitions and the connections when it comes to mass timber are so critically important to get right. And it really can be a disaster if you don't do that planning
Yes.
and work out those challenges in advance. Not a
Mhm.
project you want to, put out for bids when you still have things to figure out.
Definitely, and that's where, like, early communication with city officials too, which you might not do as in-depth on other project types, right? For this, having that communication, sharing details, making sure everybody agreed that, our detailing would work for the permitting process and for the install because a lot of that's happening simultaneously and starting to get baked in even before the permit's fully finished, so everybody needs to be on point.
You mentioned that you were working towards some sustainability goals. So, can you tell me more specifically what exactly you did in your design to meet those?
Yeah, so we got a NGBS certification as well as Energy Star for this building. I say we got, but it's getting wrapped up now. But, so like I mentioned earlier, that was some focus on air sealing, testing to make sure that the building had a tight envelope. That was looking at our material selections as well. We prioritized a lot of finished materials or structural materials that could provide environmental product declarations. So that's just making sure we're going towards manufacturers who provide that transparency among other things. And then the PSEF funds, the Portland Clean Energy funds that this project received, helped us get that really efficient VRF system, heat pump hot water heaters, like making sure that we could provide residents with both heating and cooling efficiently in the building, really critical for this population. And then even just looking at the structural system itself, KPFF early on did like a superstructure carbon study just to show the difference between what using a mass timber system uh, would do for a project versus going with something more typical like concrete. So wood has a much lower carbon footprint, especially when you're taking into consideration the sequestration of that biogenic carbon. So what wood naturally stores.
Nice. Well, I don't know about your electric bill or water bill, but I happen to live in an address that's part of the city of Portland and Multnomah
Mhm.
County. And mine has done nothing but skyrocket.
Yes. Mhm.
Yes, we're all cranky. We are all
Yeah.
cranky about that.
Same.
And so I think those efficient systems and tighter buildings, as we watch all these energy prices rise and rise, are becoming more and more critical every day. Which is, I mean, I don't want the prices to keep going up, but it's a good thing because we're more people are thinking about this than ever before, and trying to create that to because those costs are ridiculous. I won't even start. I won't won't even start. I just got my property tax bill last week. I'm not even going to start. Um, every project has some good construction stories. I love a good construction story or a surprise or a lesson learned. I've never met a project that didn't have one. There is no such thing as a perfect project. Anybody who's done this for any period of time knows that. That's why I don't call them problems. I call them challenges because it's just the way
Mhm.
this world works. Now, one of the things that popped right into my head was, oh my God, how did they stage this? Like, where did they put it? Because I looked at like a Google map to look at where this building was. I'm like, how did they do this? So I imagine that on its own was difficult. So tell me about the staging, but also tell me about one particular construction challenge you faced so far and how you dealt with it to keep the project moving.
Yeah, I'd say, for the staging, let's start there. Definitely Walsh's expertise, not mine, but that was one of the benefits of the CLT structure is just that it comes in prefabricated on the day of install. They unload it off the truck, it goes in, and the truck goes away. So, really, we had available to us the site and then portions of the street on either street elevation. One, which was mostly on the short end of the building, was the crane. right? The tower crane was a important part of this project. And then on the other side, that little strip of like one lane off of 13th where materials could be, but it also is like the main access to the site. So pretty congested, but I think that prefab system for the exterior is what made that really helpful. Mass timber was really helpful for that on this site. Um, and then in terms of lessons learned, I was actually chatting with my colleague Willie, who did a lot of the work during CA for this project and reviews and site visits and all of that. So we were both kind of laughing because people think that, mass timber would be the hard part of the project, but it really isn't. So probably a lot of the high-rise elements and coordinating fire alarm systems, stair pressurization, like all of those things like involve a lot of people and a lot of design build subs as well. So that was pretty challenging. I could talk through the one code surprise that we came upon that was pretty late and actually during construction. And that one is relative to mass timber and the new codes that we have for it. So something that our team didn't realize early on is that, the code reads for these high-rise mass timber projects that you can't have, combustible materials of any kind and all MEP materials, so all your plumbing, piping, electrical wiring, everything is supposed to be plenum rated. Um, so there was this one little hidden speck somewhere that had still for our vent stacks, and then electrical wiring, like there's the little jacketing around all the wires has PVC in it. Um, Anyway, we had some PVC or, ABS piping in the spec for vent stacks. So we went through a code appeal with the city, to prove that PVC piping, while not plenum rated, could be acceptable in wall cavities packed with insulation, and that, the minimal amounts of PVC and wiring could be acceptable if we're running those through ceiling spaces and, into insulated spaces in units. So that was kind of a funny code surprise that actually took a lot of hours of effort from everyone to figure out.
Those, yeah, any surprises during construction? I do a lot of teaching in project delivery and contract documents. And one of my mantras with design professionals is always when you take shortcuts in your documents trying to get the
Mhm.
project out, you're going to pay for that tenfold during
Yes.
construction. I know that, schedules are getting tighter and tighter and it's hard to fit everything in, but, not especially in specifications, because that's what I write,
Mhm.
not making sure you have the things that you want there and checking that
Mhm.
against other things or code or whatever it is you need to do, you pay for in spades during
Mhm.
construction, which is where a design professional typically makes the least amount of their money as well. You don't
Mhm.
want to spend extra time during construction because you're getting that small part of your contract
Exactly.
over a long period of time. So I love that you shared that story. Um, Another question popped into my head as we were talking about this, because that's just my brain. They come from nowhere. Accessibility. These units are small. Was and obviously we have very strict accessibility standards these days for these types of buildings. Was it a challenge to meet the accessibility requirements with the smaller footprint of the units in the building?
Yeah, I think it was, close attention to, making sure little things aren't moving an inch here and there, even and encroaching on those clearances. We pay close attention to accessibility requirements in all projects, but this one just required an extra level of, like, caution in anything. Like, anytime a wall needed to move, like, go check everything. And I think we did have to do a couple of things in this building that we might not do typically in other housing projects. And one of those is in the bathrooms we had wall-mounted sinks instead of a sink with a cabinet. And part of that was just like getting that clear floor space and making sure those bathrooms were functional and flexible, even in our Type B units. So we did have, of course, a number of Type A fully accessible units, and then the rest were Type B visitable, but even in those, just making sure the floor space was as open as possible. There's blocking for future install of grab bars. the showers have a minimal threshold, as minimal as possible, and option to get a bench seat in there. Um, yeah, so I think it was like any other process on any other housing project, just a little bit more challenging to get everything to fit and work well.
Well, particularly since you're looking at an older community. I know that I haven't had to work on one in quite some time, but like working on like senior living centers, it's kind of a different ball game, and some of the things you have to think about when you're serving an older community. And so that just popped in my head. Like, I can't believe I didn't ask about accessibility.
Yeah.
Uh,
Another nice detail, I think, is, at the corridors. This was something that got added back, in construction, which is a really great feature for, housing aging adults, and that's a handrail in the corridor on one side.
Important thing. It seems like in most of the types of projects I've worked on along that vein, handrails and slip resistance, and then the bathroom things like grab bars are like three of the big things. That slip resistance is a whole animal of its own, trying to figure all that out. What would you say was your biggest lesson learned from this project that made you a better architect going forward?
I think, and maybe this seems obvious, and maybe should be obvious, but communication and how truly critical it is on every project, but on these projects with so many moving parts and so many people involved, and like new information and trying to incorporate new code provisions. I think the communication aspect was so key to the success of this project. And it required a lot of attention, a lot of good note taking, the whole team being on the same page. Everybody kind of had to be at their best, and keeping those relationships amicable. I think it's easy to get caught up in things being difficult or disagreeing with your, like, city officials, for example, but having those relationships solid and knowing that we're all, like, in the service of making this a great project was really critical, and I think I've carried that with me into future projects, and you can never communicate with your teammates or with your colleagues in the community enough.
Well, while you would think that would be obvious, a lot of people talk the talk, but don't necessarily walk the walk in this business. And the building doesn't go up without all of us. Everybody involved,
Exactly.
it's not going to happen. And I think that we often very much struggle in that arena in our business, which I've never quite understood. And I also think, and you mentioned it in a different way that I'm about to mention it, but um, the value of emotional intelligence
Mhm.
and keeping those good relationships. And is there another option besides just getting ticked off at the building official?
Yeah.
So there is more than one way to approach a situation, and there will be different results depending on which way you choose. And
Mhm.
I really think that like our whole industry could use some emotional intelligence workshops. How do you? I have to work with
Definitely.
350 people. And so
Mhm.
I feel like I have to be a chameleon with every
Mhm.
individual I work with, because some people I can come in, guns blazing, get something done and run away. And in a little bit quieter, introverted people, you have to slow your roll
Yeah.
and being able to do that, I think, is very valuable.
Definitely, and I think, everybody you have to recognize that everybody on the team might have a different way of doing things, but they all have their own corner of expertise that's valuable to making a project successful. So, it's as important to, like, share your expertise as it is to step back and learn from and understand other people's expertise, and I think the best projects happen when everybody can do that.
Yeah. And listen more than you talk on occasion.
Mhm. Definitely.
So before we get to our two closing questions, tell me, this is your chance to toot your horn. Tell me what else is Holst working on now that I get to call you and say, okay, now I want to have another interview. I want to hear about this one.
Yeah. Yeah, we're working on a bunch of really exciting mission-driven projects. We typically focus on housing, health, and education. We have projects across Oregon, Washington, Mountain West region right now. But since this is a mass timber project we're talking about, I'll tell you about two more that are happening in our office. One is the East County Library, which is located in Gresham. That one's gonna wrap up in, like, spring of 2026. It's 95,000 square feet, which is really similar to the downtown Central Library. Um, it has been both Holst and Multnomah County's most in-depth community engagement effort to date. The team did so much to make sure that, the thousands of voices, involved could shape that final design. So that's gonna be a really great project, to go see when it opens. The other one is a project that I'm on, and it's Broadway Corridor. So I don't know if you've heard about the development of the post office blocks downtown Portland. It's kind of in the Pearl District on the edge near the train station. So our site is going to be a 14-story combination of mass timber for 12 stories over a concrete podium for 2 stories. And that also will be affordable housing, 229 units. We're working with Home Forward and the Urban League of Portland. That one's kind of in design and working its way towards permit. So really excited about that one.
Well, that's exciting because it's a little barren down near the train station.
Yeah, they demolished the old post office, so it's just this huge site that has, been developed into a bunch of different parcels, so I think we're gonna see a lot of cool new work coming in there.
I'm excited about that.
Mhm.
So I always close with two questions, one being a more broad industry question, and then the final question I very sarcastically say is the easiest question of the day because it's not. Starting with the more broad industry question. So I have a ginormous, huge soft spot for projects that lift people up and change their lives. Um, Available affordable housing is an issue in a lot of places, particularly for marginalized groups. How did working on such a transformative project change you as an architect and as a person? Um, and in your opinion, what can we be doing better to efficiently tackle this housing crisis? Because it feels like we're moving way too slow.
Yeah, I totally agree with that mentality. It does seem like it happens very slowly, and I think it's because it requires so many people to get these projects moving and off the ground. But I think most importantly, as individuals and our in this community and society at large, is we need to make sure we're voting to fund this kind of work. I think we all need to understand that it's so important to our communities. It matters. It has a very real and positive impact on people who live here. So that's the first thing. Recognize its importance and make sure we're voting to fund these kinds of projects. Um, I think personally, it just felt really great to see this project start to come to a close. And I'm not normally there on site during move in at a lot of our projects, but for this one, they started moving in residents right after TCO and while like final punch lists are happening. So I've been on site a couple of times over the last month and gotten to see residents coming to the building, getting their orientation, moving into their units. And it's just such a great reminder of why we spent the last few years working on this project and what it was for. I think that's just been the best part of it all.
Oh, I can only imagine, seeing these people, getting their new place and having it be such a warm and inviting place, which is not always the case. And especially in some of these older affordable housing buildings that we have around town. And it does. When you feel better, you do better. It's a game changer. So, final question. Super simple. I truly hope that we all hope to live a life that leaves some kind of contribution to make the world a better place. So I know that there can be 500 answers to this for any individual, but if you were to pick one, personal or professional, it doesn't even have to be about work. What do you hope your impact will be?
That is like a simple question, but a very big question. I think, like you said, I just want to know that the work I've done in my life has meant something, that it's helped someone, that's made a positive impact. And I think, as an architect, if I can make a city more beautiful, more accessible, more equitable, then I've done my job right. And I'm happy with that.
Well, I think we'll keep you. We'll keep you. You can't move away from Portland. You got to stay in Portland, especially because you and I need to go have a glass of whiskey sometime.
It's true. It's true.
Nici, seriously, this has been a great conversation. Lots of good, interesting stuff. I really do hats off to you and Holst for this great project and the other driven work that you do. I mean, that really, it does holds a special place in my heart. And I think the hearts of a lot of people to have, a focus towards that arena. I hope you'll come back and tell me more later. And you don't need an invitation. You can just drop me a note and say, hey, Cherise, you want to hear about this.
Thank you
And we'll
so
set
much,
it up.
Cherise.
Thank you for
Thank you
coming.
so much. Yeah, thank you for having me. It was great chatting with you today.
You can come back anytime.